So just turn with me to Habakkuk, if you would. Hopefully you may still have it open, or if you've lost it and can't find it, it's a little bit tricky. It's only a small book, 3 chapters, 5th last book of the Old Testament. Not planning on doing a exposition on Habakkuk, but we're doing the readings a little while back, and Lois and I were struck by one verse in particular, and made me start thinking about things. And so we're going to look at it this morning. We'll get to that verse a little bit later in the exhortation. But we find Habakkuk deals with the attitudes of the faithful, what attitude they need to adopt in times of trouble. We live in, the catchphrase was unprecedented times, isn't it? That's the word that was bandied around so much. Unprecedented times. In the last year or so, we've seen the world change before our very eyes. It's a completely different world to what it was, 12, 18 months ago. So by way of exhortation this morning, I'd like us to stop and to reflect upon the certainty of the great hope that we have. The certainty of the great hope we have. And also then, how do we respond to that certainty, to that hope, especially in these troubled times? So Habakkuk, we find, is very relevant for us today, exactly as we are today. Well, by way of background, we don't really know much about Habakkuk, to be honest. The very first verse of Habakkuk, he calls himself a prophet. And the very last verse, in the end of the chapter 3, which is the end of an amazing prayer, he says that it should be sung to the chief musicians with my stringed instruments. So perhaps Habakkuk was actually, besides being a prophet, he was also a Levite. But we find when we look at his message that it's so relevant for us today. Habakkuk means to embrace, to cling, one who clings. And that's very relevant to his message. It's very relevant for us, for our position. In fact, I think it's quite the key, to cling. So if you've got Habakkuk now, chapter 1, from verse 2, it says, "O Yahweh, how long shall I cry, and thou wilt not hear? Even cry out unto thee of violence, and thou wilt not save. Why dost thou show me iniquity, and cause me to behold grievance? For spoiling and violence are before me, and there are that raise up strife and contention." Habakkuk opens his message by appealing God, beseeching him. How long are you going to tolerate this violence, God? This strife and contention that's all around me. So we see Judah was now corrupt, needing God's soon intervention. Well, do we feel the same today? The world around us is just so corrupt, isn't it? There's violence and strife and contention all around. People protesting in the streets. We need God's intervention, don't we? So you can see already exactly the same sort of situation as Habakkuk faced. Well, God's response we find in verse 5. God says to Habakkuk, behold ye among the nations, and regard and wonder marvelously. For I will work a work in your days, which you will not believe, though it be told you. God says, I'm going to act. I'm going to do something amazing, something unbelievable even. Paul actually picks up that verse in Acts 13 when he's talking to the Jews of Christ. He says that you won't believe even though a man declare it unto you. even though one rose from the dead. Verse 6, God continues, "For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs." So he says, I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans. So we know Habakkuk's writing at the time of the Chaldeans, the time of the Babylonians, when they were in ascendancy. We know from history it's 605 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar defeated the Egyptians, the Battle of Carchemish, when they went to assist the Assyrians. So that gives us a bit of a date. He says in verse 6, which shall march through the breadth of the land. And then in verse 7, they are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed of themselves. So they shall do this. They shall do that. It hasn't happened as yet. So the invasion of Judah hasn't happened. So we can now set a bit of a date. We know the invasion of Judah by the Babylonians was just 8 years after the Battle of Carchemish. So that puts us around, 597. So somewhere in that period is when Habakkuk was writing, I believe. So it puts us right at the end of the reign of Josiah, or more likely, the start of the reign of Jehoiakim. That gives us a little bit of a setting. So imagine the truth of God's word had been rediscovered, been covered in layers of rubbish, hidden for ages in darkness. A great reformation has taken place. But then, gradually, sure it didn't happen overnight, gradually there's a falling away. People start to refocus on themselves, on their own prosperity. God's just a motion to go through. A Sunday morning box to tick off, perhaps. In fact, a bit of a distraction, to be honest. So much so that God finally acted. Wow, how relevant is that for us, brothers and sisters? How relevant is that for us today? Having had the truth uncovered, as it were, layers and layers of rubbish, violence and corruption all around. What's our attitude? You can see how relevant Habakkuk is to today. So much so, as we said, that God finally acted. Chapter 2, and thank you for that reading, Ross. Chapter 2, God responds to Habakkuk's pleading. He says in verse 2 of chapter 2, Yahweh answered me and said, write the vision and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that readeth it. He says, write a vision, make it plain. Plain so it can be understood. I'm not going to be able to say this any plainer. Why? That he may run that readeth it. I read that and thought, what does that actually mean? He reads it and runs away? What does that actually mean? When you look at some other translations, one puts it, write the vision, make it plain on tablets so that a runner may read it. Another translation says, write my answer on a billboard, large and clear, so that anyone can read it at a glance and rush to tell the others. Write it in big block letters so that it can be read on the run. So what God is saying to Habakkuk is, I'm going to say this plain and simple. People can't, if they're looking for it, they can't miss the message. Verse 3, God says, for the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. God says the vision is, mine says, is for an appointed time, but it's actually the appointed time. The vision is for the appointed time. The message, the Bible says, that verse, the vision message is a witness pointing to what's coming. It's aching for the coming. It can hardly wait. It doesn't lie. If it seems slow in coming, wait. It's on its way. It will come right on time. So God says, I have a set time planned. It will happen. Wait for it. It will surely come. All right, well, what was it he had to write? What was this message? Plain and simple. Look at verse 4. Behold, his soul, which is lifted up, is not upright in him. God says, pride causes a downfall. Corruption of character, reliance on self. There's no need or thought for God. I can do all things myself. I can achieve anything myself. The world encourages us to be ourself, doesn't it? Self-reliance, self-fulfillment, self-help, self-expression, self-promotion, self-love. And the thing we see being outworked all the time, selfies. In fact, interesting, if you're a man, but you self-identify as a woman, you're now eligible to stand for New South Wales Woman of the Year 2022. Incredible how society's gone, brothers and sisters. So God hates pride. He hates self. But he continues on with his simple message, but the just shall live by his faith. We talk in seminars, don't we, of these key little words, contrast words. God hates pride. He hates self, selfish ambition, putting yourself before others. But the just shall live by his faith. Those that God counts as righteous, even though they're not, it's by his faith. God's ways, God's people. See, that's the very opposite of self. It's the very opposite of pride. And we've got the key verse in verse 14. For the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh, as the waters cover the sea. Here's the key verse for Habakkuk. In fact, I believe it's the key verse for the whole of the Bible. And yet it's not the verse that struck us when we were reading Habakkuk 2. Here is God's plan and purpose outlined in one verse. Well, just keep your finger there in Habakkuk 2. come back over to Numbers 14 just quickly. Just quickly want to touch on reinforcement of what we're just looking at here. The quote that Habakkuk is referring to. Numbers 14, we know it's the time of the spies bringing the evil report back to the land. And they say, search out the land. There's the murmurings, wanting to give it all away. Want to go back to Egypt. It's all too hard. Look at verse 2, Numbers 14. All the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron and against God, of course. The whole congregation said unto them, would God that we had died in the land of Egypt. Would God we had died in this wilderness. Wherefore has Yahweh brought us unto this land, to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return into Egypt? He says, oh, it's all too hard. It's following God, following his ways. It's too hard for us. We want to do our own thing. We want to go back to Egypt and do our own thing. We'll look at over the page, or in my Bible, it's over the page anyway. Yeah? Verse 41, look at God's response in verse 21. He says, truly as I live, all the earth shall be filled with the glory of Yahweh. There's our verse that Habakkuk picks up. He says, for the faithful, it's certain all the earth will be full of the glory of Yahweh. That is our hope, brothers and sisters, and that is the certainty for those who trust in God. What an amazing vision and an amazing hope we have. Yet, there's always a but, isn't there? Verse 22, because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles, which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times, not hearken unto my voice. He says, those that have seen my glory, those that have seen the vision and rejected him, those that preferred what the world offered, the leeks and the onions and the garlic, wanted to go back to that life when in reality they were slaves. He says in verse 23, surely they shall not see the land which I swear unto their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoke me see it. So, brothers and sisters, we can see God at work in the nations now, can't we? We can see the nations stirring and in agitation. Summits about climate, masses of armies accumulating on the borders. Things going on. The angels are at work. Are we just ignoring that? Are we just turning a deaf ear? Those that have not hearkened to me, as it says in verse 22, that means literally you've turned a deaf ear to what I have to say. Are we longing for what the world offers, brothers and sisters? The world of pride and of self. God says, well, there's no place for people with that type of attitude in my kingdom. No place for them in my family. It's the same attitude that we see back in Habakkuk. Let's come back to Habakkuk now, chapter 2, verse 5. We see the contrast of pride versus those who live by his faith. Habakkuk 2, verse 5. Now also, because he transgresses by wine, he is a proud man. Okay. neither keepeth at home, who enlarges his desire as hell, and is as death, cannot be satisfied, but gathereth unto him all nations, and heaps unto him all people. God's focusing on pride. Those who focus on themselves, on increase, on never being satisfied, on wanting more and more. He says he enlarges his desire as hell. It's like a harvest of people taking their substance. And then he lists 5 woes. If you've got a Bible and you've got a pencil, colour them in. Stands out at you. 5 woes, he says in verse 6. Woe to him. Woe to him that increases that which is not his. How long? And to him that lades himself with thick clay. He says, woe to him that gives increase, who focuses on gain, on the here and the now. Verse 8, because you have spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil you, because of men's blood, for the violence of the land and of the city, and of all the blood that dwell therein. All these things that you're scheming for, that you want to add, you're going to come to naught, to nothing. Verse 9, woe to him that covets an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from the power of evil. Woe to him that covets evil gain, that builds up his nest, his own nest. Verse 12, woe to him that builds a town with blood, establishes a city by iniquity. Woe to him that builds a town based on bloodshed, on taking advantage of others. Verse 15, woe to him that gives his neighbour drink, that puts the bottle to him, makes him drunk also. Why? That he may look on their nakedness. Woe to him that has an ulterior motive in what he does. It's for himself, for his own gain, his own benefit. And the 5th one, verse 19. Woe to him that says to the wood, awake, to the dumb stones, arise. It shall teach. Behold, it is laid over with gold and silver. There is no breadth at all in the midst of it. Woe to him that turns away to worship materialism, the gold and silver of the world. You see, brothers and sisters, God's focusing on attitude, on our attitude. In fact, I believe the whole Bible can be summed up in one word: attitude. What is our attitude? It's what God's looking at. How are we living our life? What is our focus? And then we come to verse 20, and this is the verse that jumped out at us. But there's that little contrast again. The woes of all those people that are given to self-promotion, taking gain at the expense of others, just thinking about themselves and how they can build bigger and better barns. He says, but there's a contrast. Yahweh is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. With all this going on, with all this agitation and stirring and selfishness going on in all around, but the push for gain, deceit, the using and abusing of others, the focus on self, indeed even in the ecclesia of God, God says, but God is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silence before him. See, Habakkuk is pleading to us today that God is in control. He's the only true God. He resides in heaven, his holy temple. For Habakkuk and the faithful, no need to worry about the temple. The true temple is in heaven. It's the same for us today, brothers and sisters. There's no need to worry about the world. There's no need to get caught up with the things that the world sees as important. There's no need to worry about our circumstances here and now. God is in control. And our life is hid with him. Let all the earth be silent before him. You know, that word silent, it's only used 7 times in the whole of the Bible. And it's in the imperative sense. It means it's almost like a demand. Keep complete, total silence. Hush, be quiet, reflect and consider. Hold God in awe. He is in control. Saying, come before God in reverence and respect. Give him the honour that's due to him. There is no other. We must never lose sight of our sense of reverence, brothers and sisters. Our God is the creator of heaven and earth. This present world and all its foaming and agitation and stirring, it's passing away. As are we, if Christ doesn't return yet. But God is the eternal God. He is in his holy temple. It does not change. Habakkuk says, stop. Be quiet. Reflect and consider. And so as a result of that, Habakkuk goes in chapter 3 and he gives an amazing prayer. The whole of chapter 3 is his prayer. And obviously we won't go all the way through it, but just a couple of little verses from Habakkuk 3. He says in verse 3, God came from Teman and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Selah. God, or Eloah. It's a singular of mighty one. He says, it's actually in the future tense, with my version says God came. Wycliffe Bible says will. The mighty one will come from Teman. That's the Southland. The Holy One from Mount Paran. That's Mount Sinai. Here we have a prophecy given to us by Habakkuk, a vision of Christ and the saints. If you look at Psalm 68, it ties it in of the chariots, talking of exactly the same time. Psalm 68 of Christ and the saints. It says in the end of verse 3, his glory covers the heavens. The earth was full of his praise. His brightness was as the light. He had horns coming out of his hand. There was hiding in his power. The margin there says there were bright beams coming out of his side. This is a vision of Christ and the saints, brothers and sisters. Verse 5, before him went the pestilence. That's interesting, isn't it? Before him went the pestilence. And burning coals went forth at his feet. He stood and measured the earth and beheld and drove asunder the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered. The perpetual hills did bow. His ways are everlasting. Here we have the judgment on the nations by Christ and the saints. He talks of, in verse 13, of thou wentest forth for the salvation of thy people, for salvation with thine anointed. Thou woundest the head. Whenever we hear of the wounding of the head, the crushing of the head, we think of the serpent, don't we, in the garden. Crushing of the head out of the house of the wicked. That's serpent thinking. He says, at the end of verse 13, Selah, pause and consider the work of Christ and the saints to judge the nations, to crush that serpent thinking, to restore, as it were, the Garden of Eden. And he concludes his prayer in verse 17. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, the labour of the olive shall fail, the field shall yield no meat, the flock shall cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. So all these things would have been a tragedy for them. All around them is chaos and madness. The fig tree is not providing. The olive, the flocks, the herds. Even though all these things, he says, you see our circumstances of life now, even though things aren't as we might expect, he says in verse 18, yet I will rejoice in Yahweh, despite all these things going on around me. Yet I will rejoice in Yahweh. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Isn't that amazing, brothers and sisters? What a great lesson that is for us. Verse 19, Yahweh, God, is my strength. He will make my feet like hinds' feet. So Yahweh, God, it's actually that word there is Adonai. It's the plural, the word God I'm referring to. Yahweh, God. Adonai, it's the plural of Adon. It's the only place in the Old Testament where it's translated as God. Most times it's translated as Lord. So literally we have here, he who will be lords, or he who will be rulers, it's in the plural. It's my strength. He will make my feet like hinds' feet. He who will be rulers, he makes me to walk in elevated places. He says he makes me walk upon my high places. See, despite what's going on around us, he can lift us up. He can give us a new perspective to see the vision of what lay ahead. How amazing, brothers and sisters. How amazing. So we started by looking at the message of the one true God, the vision that was going to be so plain, so certain that even one who runs, one who rushes past, could understand. It's the vision of our salvation, brothers and sisters, despite the circumstances of life, despite the fact that the Chaldeans are about to invade, despite the fact that there's chaos all around us, uncertainty in life. It's the vision of our salvation. He lifts us up to high places. Reminds us of Hebrews 12, doesn't it, when it talks about even though one who runs can see this vision plainly. Paul says in Hebrews 12, seeing we are so compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses. Let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us. So Habakkuk has set that vision there for us. We know the end goal. We don't need to worry about the circumstances of life. We don't need to worry about conspiracy theories and the agitations of society. We've got a higher calling. We've been lifted up to an elevated position to see the vision of God's kingdom. So let us run, brothers and sisters. Let us comprehend. Let us trust in God. The just shall live by his faith. You notice it says, shall live by his faith, or will. It's not, well, he might, or hopefully he might, or he could. The just shall live. He will live by his faith. That's the certainty of our vision, the certainty of our hope, brothers and sisters. So we're sharing the emblems now. Let's look to Jesus. He will come. Not at an appointed time, at the appointed time. God has an appointed time. He is in control. He is in his holy temple, and he will act at his time. Just like the prayer of Habakkuk. Although things may not work out as we'd hoped, maybe things don't work out as we expected in this life. But truly, the earth will. We can have absolute confidence. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. We've been given an amazing opportunity, brothers and sisters, in this crazy world to stop, to reflect, to consider. And as we consider now, our Lord, referred to Hebrews 12, verse 2 says, who the author and finisher of the faith, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the throne, the right hand of the throne of God. God is in his holy temple. God is in control. Our Lord will come, brothers and sisters, if we trust, if we have faith, if we look to him. He will come. And he will take us as his bride. What an amazing vision we have. What an amazing hope. Let's be silent before him. Let's stop. Let's be quiet. Let's reflect. And now, let's consider. Thank you.